Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining ASMGI today. We're going to get started now. We have a terrific webinar workshop on DevSecOps. We're going to go through a number of scenarios and options and processes for DevSecOps within an organization. Today's workshop and webinar is going to be interactive, so we do ask that you use the Q&A box or function on the Zoom webinar if you have any questions, and we'll get to them. We want to welcome our presenters today, Frank Yako and John Meyer, both of ASMGI. So guys, why don't you take it away and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, today's workshop is DevSecOps. Is it really possible to DevSecOps? So getting into it, my name is John Meyer. I'm a solutions architect at ASMGI. I'll be joined today by Frank. Frank, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me, CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives at ASMGI. Looking forward to the conversation.
Definitely. So go over some of our agenda and our objectives for this webinar today. Some of them listed here: provide an overview and introduction to DevSecOps concepts. So, the objective there is really just to get into the weeds a little bit with DevSecOps and what, some of those processes are behind it. Discuss the business case and correlation of DevSecOps to a digital first strategy. So a couple of those are buzzwords that we hear a lot. We want to clarify how those two can work together and better each other in this case. Also, we want to demonstrate how to assess DevSecOps maturity in an organization. This is pretty important. A lot of companies are trying to move towards DevSecOps and/or digital first, and having a way to meaningfully be able to assess where you're at as an organization or your maturity in those things is going to be hugely beneficial going forward. We'd also like to try to touch on how to align DevSecOps with compliance and a digital first strategy. So, that's kind of goes in line with also creating the business case too. All those things are important to businesses. A lot of them have financial impacts. And so trying to get those things to line up makes it a lot easier to not only start an initiative, but follow through with it as well. And then finally, after that, gets us some questions and closing comments that the audience might have. So first, thought it would be good to just kind of go over what the meaning of DevSecOps is, at least, to us and what we see in the industry. And I found a good excerpt from Forest Point that kind of summed it up, what I thought summed it up really, really well. DevSecOps is short for Development, Security, and Operations, obviously. Its mantra is to make everyone accountable for security with the objective of implementing security decisions and actions at the same scale and speed as development and operations decisions and actions. So obviously, when you look at it, the purpose of this is to move security to the left. That means integrating it into development and operations. And the whole purpose of that is to hopefully speed up the development of applications and operations post-deployment. So I thought this summed that up very well. I don't know if Frank, if you want to add anything to that as well.
Yeah, I think it's important to really focus on the three aspects, which is really the whole idea of DevSecOps versus DevOps, or even just development by itself. And one of the things, and John, certainly like your thoughts on this as well, is one of the reasons why we're doing this particular workshop is that we've presented on this topic before, and really with the intent of educating our listeners to just the basic concept of DevSecOps. And it really came down to, as the title implies, is it really possible to do these things versus just something out of a textbook? And that's really one of the things we hope you walk away from this discussion, is that this is real. It's just not some consultant speak, that it's the concepts that can be applied to an organization and ultimately to help you move your overall DevSecOps agenda forward. So, John, any thoughts on that? I mean, that's really really the core of what we want to get across today.
Yeah, I mean, even getting back to when we were on the last slide, the objectives, just pointing out that, yeah, we know these are buzzwords, but there's also a meaning behind them as well. And there's also a purpose for them within an organization. And, I think, kind of going a little deeper into this too, making security, the responsibility of everybody within the development chain and the operations chain. It also makes security more than just being one person in an organization or more than one department in an organization. Making it everybody's responsibility is also going to make it a lot easier to follow things, and hopefully a lot more cost effective for an organization. Because those things will just become part of the process, in every department within an organization or within every discipline within an organization, and hopefully lead to better outcomes. I guess that kind of brings us to the next thing, episodic versus continuous compliance. What does that even mean in and of itself? So I think, traditionally, what we see is in this graphic here, for instance, is traditionally we have our development cycle, from planning to post deployment, and security becomes an afterthought on that. We release this product into the world, security evaluates it to make sure that everything's okay with it, and then if there is any issue with it, we have to go sort of back to the drawing board, if you will. So there's a lot of refactoring that goes into that. And we refer to that as episodic security because it's almost like a TV episode airing every Friday. In the second graphic, we see, if we put security throughout this whole cycle and make it continuous, we don't have to do that. We can pick up on things that are being done within each phase. And if there's something that, was missed, or a vulnerability that pops up, or we notice that we used an older version of a open source library or something like that, we can go back and we can correct that right then and there before we push it on to the next phase within the development lifecycle. And I think, that in and of itself, if most organizations could get that right, would save them so much time, so much money, and gain them so much more efficiency within their process. So I think, that's one of the most important things that we were trying to point out here with this graphic, is just the importance of actually putting that security into every phase and integrating it and embedding it before it cascades, into something far larger. With episodic, I think that's a perfect word to describe it. If we have to take things back to the drawing board, whatever issue was in that release, for instance, could cascade to other phases within it as well that need corrected, because they're going based on something that was done that wasn't done correctly in the first place. So I think, one of the things we want to do, and this kind of brings us to the workshop aspect of this, is kind of approach this in a scenario format where we have somebody trying to qualify an organization for an assessment. Let's say it's a financial organization. They're looking to deploy a new application for their customers, and how that would kind of look, for that organization, trying to figure out where they are now, and the things that they have to implement, or the processes they have to implement, and the tools that they have to implement to get them on that track of integrating security throughout the organization, and hopefully saving them some budget dollars and all that. So I think, in a creative fashion, I wanted to take on an evaluator role, and Frank here is going to be our trusty CISO who reached out for this engagement, to try and figure out what the organization needed to do. So, getting Frank involved as a CISO for this organization, we can begin to ask questions and figure out, where all that sits. So one question that we could start off with would be, would you consider your current security posture episodic or continuous?
It's a great question, and I would say we definitely would consider it to be continuous. I mean, we had again, speaking hypothetically, had been in that mode of more of a traditional doing testing at the end of, say, the development cycle, which then resulted in budget overruns and all types of issues. We realized that that model was not sustainable. It was not going to allow us to continue to push out updates to our applications in a timely manner. And so we have began the process of going towards that continuous cycle. So, we realize that does require the investment in some tools. So as part of the development process, we've embedded some things in that. So a couple of them is just initially doing peer reviews of code, as well as scanning of our infrastructure to make sure that we don't have any issues there. And then we've also gone towards not quite the point of doing infrastructure as code, but realize that that's important as well. And that's something that we have on our roadmap. The goal and through this whole process is to also do some threat modeling way upstream in the process, so that we're not, again, waiting till the very end to identify what the threat model is for a particular solution and whether that induces any type of problems for the organization.
That's great. I mean, that's some of the things that we want to hear. I mean, it's definitely sounds like you've gotten a good start to all this. I guess as a follow-up to that, what are some of the tools and how do they achieve a greater security for you guys, greater security posture?
So, way early in the process, we realized that, we had to do architecture reviews of a potential solution. One, to look at whether our current environment, both from an infrastructure and application perspective, could support a secure design model. So that was one of the first things. And, that's, at least initially, is more of a manual process. But the goal was to really make sure that early on, we identify whether there was things that we were going to have to quote unquote code around to ensure that our applications were secure from an overall architecture perspective. And again, coupling that with the threat modeling process to allow us to get to the point where then once we started development, we could also begin to validate those assumptions that we were making as well. So, part of that process involved implementing some very basic tools, static application security testing capabilities, some dynamic application security testing, as well as software composition analysis. And we can get into details of those if you'd like. But the goal was to get to a point where, again, way early on in the development cycle, we were doing these things, empowering the developers to actually do some of these things themselves, and then have the checks and balances with the security and operations teams to interpret the results of that, of those tools and scans, so that we could then triage those and determine what changes might be required based on the original designs and architecture assumptions that were made. So it really was a good first start for us to start going through that process and to get to a point where we were comfortable that we were going down that early path of DevSecOps.
That's great. And a lot of the tools that are pointed out, those can be pretty agnostic across any software development lifecycle. And that kind of brings us to something that really, I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but really when we start talking about the software development lifecycle, there's several different software development lifecycle models out there. Where I think DevOps and DevSecOps differ, when we think of DevOps, we tend to kind of pair that with the one on the end, Agile or Scrum, very modern development, centric microservices, things like that. I think where DevSecOps can really excel is that it can be more open. We can integrate it with multiple different SDLC methodologies or models. As you pointed out, some of the tools that you guys were using for scanning and stuff like that, those are things, and some of the processes, even like the architectural design reviews, those are things that you can put into place and really in any of the software development lifecycle models. Because really it's just a check and a balance after a step within a phase where you're checking your work essentially, and if anything needs to be corrected, you can correct it in flight as opposed to waiting till the very end to do things. So I think this concept of narrow versus open is something, at least for me, that was pretty new, but it resonated a lot because, things that, we can do for an organization, we can do them for any organization. We can make these things agnostic. We can implement them wherever. So, going back to that, starting with the CISO, as we mentioned, with each of these security steps can be used across any SDLC method. We can see how they would translate. So, speaking of SDLCs, though, kind of taking it back to our maturity assessment interview, we can kind of, again, put our hats on to some of these qualifying questions as well. And we can kind of take more of a developer approach to this as well. So, if we're talking to an organization and we want to engage their software development team, we can begin to start asking some questions around that as well. One of the biggest questions I think in regards to the SDLC is, what are some of the processes used throughout the SDLC phases to maximize the benefit of security tools being used? And again, we'll ask Frank to put on a hat here. He could be the developer. He's already got the glasses on. Looks like a smart guy. But I think that's a good question to start with, though. What are some of the processes used throughout your SDLC in this financial organization to maximize the benefit of those tools? What are you guys doing, and how do you use them?
So, as we discussed, I mean, one of the opportunities with DevSecOps is to quote unquote shift to the left, and that starts with the actual developers. So, again, if in our case, the developers, were educated on the fact that security was their responsibility. It wasn't a throw the rock over the wall to the security team. And so as part of that, we actually integrated some tools directly into their IDE environment. So the goal was to empower them so that as they're actually doing their day-to-day work, they have the ability to validate the types of things that they're doing and whether there's any type of security issues associated with that. So in this particular case, we use Visual Studio, and we had some plugins that allowed us to use that software composition analysis tool that I mentioned, or my peer, the CISO, mentioned earlier. And so that, again, right out of the gate, as we're using those types of tools or libraries as part of our overall development process, we can quickly understand what type of vulnerabilities might exist, validate those, with our security team, and determine whether there's some type of systemic problem with those, or if there's something that is just a version upgrade on those particular instances or open source libraries in some cases. So in addition to that, we mentioned that, this is not something you want to do in a vacuum. So the idea of doing peer reviews on code, making sure that best practices are being adhered to. And then, as part of that, also doing scans periodically just to make sure that how the coding was done, there's not vulnerabilities that might exist as far as some of the practices that were used to actually do the actual development. And again, the goal on all this is to make sure that it's done as part of the normal day-to-day activities of the team, and not something that is so far downstream that you have to undo potentially the functionality of an application if there was some type of issue. And then the goal is to get to a point where, again, if we're doing those things, and we are doing those things on a day-to-day basis, it just overall improves the throughput of the team.
Yeah, those are all important processes. And again, they're agnostic processes. Those can be part of any SDLC. I mean, every SDLC has like certain things that are just always being done: developing code, testing code, releasing. So I guess another question we can ask then is how do you guys approach testing right now, and what does that look like in your environment?
So we pretty much run let's call it a standard set of tests on all of our code prior to delivery and release. And And again, we know that delivery and release can mean a lot of different things in various organizations. That could be, either major releases or patch releases, even security fixes. But the goal is to basically do that standard set of tests on all of our releases so that there's no exception to that. We're not surprised, and there's no skipping of those steps, so that we have a good foundation for what's been done in that whole development cycle, and we can assume that that those things have basically eradicated the most typical types of issues, so that if there were some type of events, we're not second guessing whether those things have been done, and then looking for the exceptions rather than some of the most basic things that might occur without doing those types of tests. So again, we go through and do things like unit testing, acceptance testing, regression testing whenever we go and make any types of changes. And then also performance testing, because as everyone knows, it's very easy to induce problems into an environment or application with changes. And if we're not going through those basic things as an ongoing basis, then we just are leaving ourselves open for trouble. And even though we're doing some of those in an automated fashion, many of those are still manual, but our ultimate goal is to get to a point where we're automating as many of those activities as possible.
It's good to hear. I mean, those tests are very important. I mean, everybody should be doing those types of tests, when they're developing software. I think this can be to your point, automating some of those things too, and making them more efficient can be accomplished through a couple of different ways. Obviously tooling, if you've got a more mature CI/CD tool set, and scripting, and that allows for a higher frequency of testing, which can lead to catching more vulnerabilities and mistakes in the code before it's released. So I think down the line, as we talk about this too and discuss things, that frequency is going to become more of a point, and it's going to become more important to the whole DevSecOps process and being digital first and being competitive in a marketplace as well.
Yeah, and that's a good point as far as the frequency goes, because as a lot of us know, in the past, the frequency of releases, was very, very low. There was times where, that was only happening once, twice, a few times a year, but that, more or less has gone by the wayside. The idea of continuous integration, continuous delivery is here to stay. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but that becomes the minimum ante for an organization to be viable in today's world. There has to be that cadence of the continuous delivery and enhancements to the solutions that are delivered, and that ultimately is the only way to do that is to embed those processes as part of your overall SDLC.
Sure. So shifting gears a little bit, I think one of the other things we wanted to talk about too, because we did mention it earlier, is being digital first. Kind of taking a break from our scenario where we're assessing this organization here. I think it's important to point out what digital first means. First of all, again, great quote that I had found that summed it up really well. A modern digital first organization is fully optimized their customer experience, operating model, and employee experience for digital execution. Employees have the tools, training, supporting leadership, culture, and teamwork to work from anywhere, anytime. And I think that that sums it up so well, because being digital first, some of the bullet points on the left there really point out what digital first is and how we become digital first. First off is maximizing digital interactions, making things more collaborative. We know right now, there's a lot going on. We have a pandemic going on, so a lot of people are working remote, for instance. Being able to maximize digital interactions is key right now, more than probably any other time we've ever experienced. Being able to bring people together that are not close physically. Being able to access applications from anywhere and making applications just generally more accessible, making data cloud accessible so that it's able to be more easily accessed from applications by people, and being able to automate processes to free up our teams for more innovation. So when we think about digital first, again, it sounds like a buzzword, but there's a meaning behind it. And I think some of the questions too, when we get into this cloud of buzzwords, is what are some of the differences between some of these? Because there's digital transformation, there's cloud first. And I kind of think of that, and I think digital transformation is more of like the process a company goes through to become digital first, and being cloud first is more or less just part of being digital first. So I guess one of the things that we thought would be kind of good for this workshop was trying to get some of the audience participation in this too. So kind of wanted to ask a question or take a poll. How many in the audience feel their organization is digital first or is on a DevSecOps path currently? And I think we should have a poll coming up here.
So John, is we're waiting for the responses to that. One of the things that you mentioned was the potential impact of COVID-19 on some of those strategies. And so, one of the things that we did get a question in, how has COVID-19 impacted organizations' plans for digital first? And so I would, pose that to you to ask if there was any, what experience have you seen with some of the clients that we've dealt with on these items?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely had some firsthand examples where it's made it more of a central issue for those clients in many different ways. For some of those clients, it's really trying to get out of they're trying to get out of the data center business, which again kind of sounds buzzy. I think a lot of organizations are trying to get out of what they would call the data center business, but looking for co-location or trying to migrate applications or servers to the cloud. So we've definitely had, I would say, a very large uptick in projects associated to those things. We've also had some projects come across that are focused on VDI, or more importantly, Microsoft Azure Windows Virtual Desktop. And the only reason I point that out by name isn't because I'm a Microsoft fanboy, but because they really are, probably the most mature with a cloud solution for virtual desktops right now. And so a lot of, when people are trying to figure out if they can put desktops in the cloud, that's pretty much one of the only players in the game. Obviously, you could do that on AWS as well, but Microsoft bakes their whole licensing structure in because it's their platform and everything. So it makes it a little more palatable. But we've had to do some TCO analysis on stuff like that. And there's definitely been a lot more of a push for everything having to do with getting out of a corporate headquarters, if you will, and being able to enable their employees remotely, enable them for remote work. So, putting things in centralized places is the best way to describe that, whether it's desktops, data, servers, you name it, infrastructure. So I think that the pandemic has definitely put the pedal to the metal, if you will, on those kinds of initiatives in a way that I've not seen before. And I think that's because, in large part too, some of these organizations are just anticipating the fact that even if they go back to their offices, they're going to be doing hybrid office models potentially. And for some, they might not go back to the office at all. If it's a real small company, and they figured out how to get everybody working from home, what's the point of 10 to 50 employees going back to an office and paying for all that office space, potentially a downtown area or something like that, when you could get everything done that you need to get done with the the same or better efficiency working remote. And actually our poll results came back and we got an 83% on yes. So, I mean, that's encouraging. And I don't think it's remiss to say that some of that as well is probably due to the pandemic, accelerating some of that too. There's, like I said, even in our business, we've seen a lot of our clients really pushing, on a digital first front.
Yeah, and that I agree with that. I mean, and that not only from the, if you want to call it the infrastructure or the technology perspective, but also from the standpoint of connecting people, because as you mentioned, in a lot of cases, organizations are not, sitting next to their peers or the different departments that they might interact with, and that goes for both, small, large, and enterprise organizations. So, the ability to have technology support that organization from a workflow perspective, from the perspective of being able to monitor and track, an instrument, a business. I like to use that term sometimes, to set SLAs to define how the organization needs to interact with the various entities to support its clients or business. Those are all the types of things that become critical for supporting that digital first model and are part of becoming a digital first organization. And then ultimately that's part of an overall digital transformation, because then as that type of information becomes available, it can be shared, both within an organization and with its customers or clients as well. And then, certainly the cloud, quote unquote, can support that as well, to help to facilitate that process. And whether that's, cloud infrastructure or even SaaS applications as well.
Sure. I think, it's important to point out too, some of the aspects of, moving some of this stuff to the cloud is, what's the meaning behind it and how does it help a business? One of the cases for virtual desktops, for instance, is, if we have to do virtual desktops, if you're using something like a traditional VDI solution, that's going to typically be in your corporate data center, and even if you have employees that are 2 states away, they've got to access their virtual desktop from the same place as somebody who maybe lives a mile down the road. Windows Virtual Desktop, for instance, or putting it in AWS, if you can do desktops in AWS, you can put those in different regions that are closer to those types of employees that need to use those. And also, for data protection, I think one of the things that we haven't pointed out really yet, talking about the digital first stuff, is all these companies now are arguably more open to breaches and attacks than they were before the pandemic, because there's so many more attack vectors, given that people are working from home and on unsecured home networks and whatnot. So being able to utilize cloud resources like that enables you to build a level of security around your data that you can't do when somebody's using a VPN and just using their laptop at home or at a coffee shop. So, I think there's a huge security aspect to being able to be digital first and, cloud first as well. And, going back to our poll, I don't, to make this as interactive as possible, if anybody is out there that would like to share their examples of how their organization is making a digital first push, please feel free to unmute, and we'd like to have that conversation with you. I mean, obviously you can genericize it. You don't have to spill any information that would be proprietary by any means, but we'd definitely be interested in hearing if anybody out there has, any examples, especially this year, given what we're going through.
And I think as part of that, and we'll see if anyone would like to share their experience. This is not something that just started yesterday. I mean, I'm sure everyone's heard the term, software is eating the world, type of mantra, and all the things that we've talked about as far as that type of transformation is really as a result of instrumenting a business, getting visibility or having visibility to all types of information about an organization, whether it's the business processes, whether it's your supply chain, the partners that you interact with, all different parts of how a business operates. And that information can yield all types of critical things about how an organization impacts or operates itself within its marketplace, its overall ecosystem, provides services to its customers or clients. And those are the kinds of things that ultimately have to be delivered by software. And then as a result of that, certainly there's larger amounts of data, as you mentioned, and the software solutions to ultimately capture that information, manage it, analyze it. And those are all the types of things that we're talking about, requiring then, the ability to secure that information, as well as the applications that support those types of initiatives.
Well, like I said, I encourage anyone that wants to join in, please join in. But for time's sake, we'll keep things moving here. As I said when I presented that slide, we were shifting gears into digital first. It was probably kind of jarring, but the point of that was so that we can then tie that into DevSecOps as well. So I feel like there's a lot of overlap in how these two initiatives come about. So becoming a digital first organization can foster growth and use of SaaS applications, cloud native modern development practices. It allows for greater efficiencies when applying DevSecOps tooling and methods. It also enables access anywhere controls and remote first policies to accelerate the delivery of applications and digital services. So I think, being DevSecOps can help an organization immensely being digital first. As we implement these digital first practices and cloud first, making digital interactions increase and putting our applications closer to the data, we need those security controls in place to make sure that all of that is functioning the way that it should and in a secure fashion. They also require cultural shifts. Both of those things require a cultural shift. We're moving security to the left. We're telling people that that at least felt like they never had to worry about security, that they now have to worry about security. So I think that in and of itself, creates a cultural shift in any organization. But as the graphics here show, enabling better collaboration, that goes hand in hand with both of those. Being cloud focused, hand in hand with both of those. Whether it's hybrid cloud or going full public cloud, we've seen both. We deal with both depending on the client. Bringing applications closer to the users. When we talk about SaaS applications or the applications that users have to use, like web applications and stuff like that, the easiest way to do that is in a lot of ways, in a lot of scenarios, is cloud first, because you can put those apps and you can replicate them between regions. Making security every user's responsibility. Again, that's a huge one. As I said, kind of goes to the bottom one there with creating the cultural shift. Making remote work easier, which right now is pretty key. Accelerating delivery of digital services. The more efficient we can build security into things and the less we have to refactor, the faster we can deliver features, the faster we can deliver software, the faster we can deliver products. That's all going to be, that all translates to more dollars for an organization. So I think that's kind of how we see how these both tie together very strongly. And again, if there's anybody out there that has experiences with this, we encourage you to join in on the conversation. One of the things that we're definitely interested in is what some of the DevSecOps tools and processes that some of the organizations that you guys belong to are using. And again, you can genericize that. You don't have to have a company behind the tool, just, whether it's, SCA tools, SaaS tools, things like that. And do you find that those are driven by digital first initiatives or vice versa? Is your organization currently implementing or using DevSecOps practices, and does that aid in your digital first initiatives. I think for a lot of companies, they'll find that if they look into that, they'll find as well that they go very hand in hand. I don't know, Frank, if you've got any insight on that as well, from some of our clients.
I think going back to the, some of the things that we were talking about, I mean, the traditional, work of just doing some of the basic things like vulnerability scans on applications, pen testing, and then, remediating issues. I mean, those are some of the minimum things organizations used to do. But now, like we've talked about, just the ability to integrate the testing as part of code commits, or even doing some of the IDE plugins, like we mentioned, to identify any vulnerabilities with open source libraries. I mean, those are some of the things that we're definitely seeing a huge uptick on. There's certainly a large use of open source is that trend or change has continued to occur in the world, and that at the same time, exposes organizations. So they can't just assume that there's no vulnerabilities in those. Doing the software composition analysis of those has been extremely important, and making sure that an organization knows what is actually even driving, or the basis of many of the critical applications that they have. So, again, that just goes back to those basic blocking and tackling, so that there is no things that are not unknowns, or at least you can measure the risk that might be associated with the use of some of those, in that case, open source, but certainly in some of the techniques that are being used in how the solutions are being developed. So that's extremely important.
Sure. Sorry, don't know what happened there. Everything kind of jumped, but kind of getting back to what you were saying, I think too, to add to that, kind of going back to the remote work aspect of all these things too, is I think that one of the ways that these go hand in hand, and especially with digital first, expertise in specific technologies, I think we all know that that's hard to find. We've all tried to hire people that, were subject matter experts, and finding someone in your area is sometimes very hard, depending on what you're looking for. And I think that, remote work definitely opens up the talent search around the country and even worldwide. I think there's an ever-growing spectrum of technology to boot. There's new stuff coming out every day. And finding subject matter experts for something that's very new, for instance, can be very hard. So being able to open your talent search to the world brings those experts even closer, because they are more spread out now than probably ever before. So I think enabling remote work brings, as I said, those experts closer. And I think that that becomes a huge push for digital first as well, because it's enabling these organizations to broaden their talent searches, and not be so afraid to introduce new technologies because they can't find somebody in their area that's familiar with it.
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened with our with Zoom, but I did lose my visual for a second there, so sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Hopefully we're all on the same page now. I guess that kind of brings us to, making the business case for all this. I think that's key to all this. I don't think anybody can move forward with an initiative in an organization if they can't justify the business case for it. So, as I've said, in the previous slides before, frequency of feature releases, going back to that, it's become way more competitive than ever in the software marketplace. With so many competing technologies, it probably has never been more important than it is now. Implementing efficient DevSecOps processes can speed delivery and time to market, and keep an organization safe from security breaches. Being that we're integrating security into all those phases, from the planning phase through post-deployment, we don't have to go back to the drawing board so much if we do this right. And therefore we can keep a cycle of continuous integration and continuous delivery, if you will. I think now, it's fair to say too, ransomware and breaches have become way more commonplace. And again, current pandemic has probably, in fact, I know it has exacerbated that. Even, in our world, we've had some clients that we've had to address this with, unfortunately. And, through the pandemic, although all this will end at some point, they started shipping vaccines and everything. So hopefully sooner than later. It's still going to be hard. There's still going to be things that are here to stay. Remote work is going to be one that's here to stay. And for many organizations, that exposes them to a lot more attack vectors. So, just racing to the cloud alone and trying to remain competitive can also create security loopholes due to the speed at which organizations are trying to move. That probably leads them to overlook a lot of important requirements in some instances. So, I think that that is the business case. Any kind of security breach that you have, it could potentially cost a company thousands, millions of dollars, depending on what happened, depending on what information was taken, lawsuits that get filed. So I think the business case becomes very apparent if you can frame, the initiative correctly. When you combine those two things, risk and, market competitiveness, I think you've got a good case for any of these initiatives that are part of the DevSecOps model.
Yeah, I think just going back to that as well, again, not to dwell on the pandemic per se, but, there was a lot of initiatives that organizations might have been deprioritizing over time or historically, that with the assumption that they could either get by with manual processes or that assuming that humans were interacting, within proximity of each other, and that did not, obviously hold up with the pandemic. And that's something that, if an organization was at least identified those as opportunities, this certainly has highlighted the need to move those initiatives forward. And then, as we've talked about, with the requirement to make sure that all that's being done in a secure way, that just highlights the importance of DevSecOps to complement those digital first and digital transformation initiatives.
It's a great point. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, a lot of things that companies did probably were under the assumption that people were operating in proximity to each other. I like the way that you phrased that too. Obviously, if someone's just having a conversation in a hallway, there's no evidence that can be leaked out to somebody infiltrating your network. A lot of that now, everything goes over some kind of communication line, whether it's voice, whether it's instant message, and I think we've seen all of that get compromised over the course of the last 9 months. Even what we're on now, Zoom. There was people that got into conversations with that. So it's out there, and it's something that everyone has to be ready for. And I wanted to throw this in to kind of pull the curtain back. I think we're kind of ambiguous, talking about security and implementing security in every phase of the software development lifecycle here. This kind of gives a good visualization of that. Do we have effective monitoring? Do we have code security? Do we have compliance and reporting? That's effective and being done. So on this slide also, you can see some of those tools that are used. Under code security, we've got threat modeling and design review, which we talked about earlier. Static analysis, which we talked about earlier. DAST, or dynamic analysis, pen test and bug fixes. And then on the compliance aspect of that, vulnerability management, being able to detect and respond, and reporting. And then obviously, kind of at the tail end of that, if you look at the DevOps infinity figure 8, the tail end of that, process being monitoring. Do we have effective monitoring in place for security and for infrastructure and for the applications themselves? So I thought this visual put some of the tooling and processes around those tools into some perspective for some of the people on the webinar here. Utilizing those tools effectively is just as important as the tools themselves, though. And I think, that's where we kind of go into the next direction of our assessment, is on the infrastructure front, talking to a manager of infrastructure, for instance. So, again, Frank's putting on his infrastructure hat here. With our financial organization that we have here that's on the eve of launching their new application, what are some of the ways in which your organization monitors applications and infrastructure and security, and what are some of the tools and checks on those tools?
So, as most organizations, we use the basic, monitoring for up, downtime, as well as some of the most basic functions. And that's where, the big difference starts to kick in, is that, you have to really look beyond just the is the on or off, are you doing the basics like, anti-malware, or even, making sure that you have your OS patches. The world really has moved beyond that. You have to have an active vulnerability management program, which I know you mentioned. And that's something that is, probably one of the most misunderstood components of, IT, is what the difference between the vulnerability management and just your basic patching and doing software updates. So that's something that, we've been actively doing for a while now. We do periodic scans. We go through the process of prioritizing those items, and then make sure that, we keep up to date on the various risks that are out there. And as you probably are aware, there's risks associated with all those different activities that are, or items that are identified as part of this process. And part of what we try to do is to make sure that we are prioritizing those items, and our tools help us to do that as well, so that we can justify the effort that goes into the actual remediation process. Because there are times where those have to be done fairly quickly, especially if 0-day types of items are identified, or with even some of the most recent things that have been going on in the world. Those things that have high risks associated when they have to be turned around in a fairly short time frame.
Yeah, I mean, this is an integral part of the maturity level of an organization, especially in the later phases of the DevOps and DevSecOps model. For one, you're investing in these tools. So if we're not using them effectively, we're not achieving the most value out of them. And these insights that we gain from these tools can be very important in predicting DevSecOps health of an organization. In the health of your infrastructure. I mean, even on a more physical level. To your point too, vulnerability management. I mean, that's definitely a more holistic way of looking at security as well. I think a lot of companies out there, they've got monitoring tools set up. They're collecting logs. They have a SIM, but are those things really being reviewed? Is there a cadence for them? Are we really doing any kind of correlation on those and analysis where we can kind of predict the health of the environment, and whether or not things are being addressed as efficiently as they should, and with the speed that they should?
Yeah, and that's key. I mean, there's no question that the types of things that are identified as part of that process are just not related to the IT or the infrastructure side of the world. It could include how something was developed, as we talked before, or changes that may have occurred in how something was implemented. And so it's important to make sure that all the teams are involved in understanding what is showing up as part of those scans and that whole vulnerability management program. If we're doing all those things that we've talked about upstream, the goal is to minimize the types of items that are appearing downstream. But it doesn't mean that there's things that might not creep in, or just have to be dealt with. So that's where it really becomes important to have that cadence, as you mentioned, to do these things just as a matter of business versus as a reactive type of activity, hence the continuous portion of that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these tools, especially the monitoring tools, the whole purpose of them is to be proactive, and I think a lot of that gets lost in translation as well. So it's important that there's effective processes put around all those things. One of the ways we can make sure that that's happening is assessing the organization holistically and where they stand in their DevSecOps processes. So, little background before we get into the next part of our workshop here. Is looking at the DevSecOps or DevOps model. A lot of you have probably seen the infinity figure eight of it. Design, develop, test, build, release, deliver, monitor. So those we can consider phases. All those phases, in order to meet those phases, there's requirements. Each phase also, we can kind of assess the risk to the business. If we don't meet a certain requirement, what is the risk level to the business? What is the maturity level of having a certain tool or a process that meets the requirements of that phase? Going back to what we were talking about on the one slide when we were talking about testing, some of the testing is done manually, but the hope is to have it automated. So we can check off a box, we could check off a requirement because we're absolutely doing the testing, but are we mature in our testing? On a scale of 1 to 5, maybe we're only at a 1, we're doing everything manually, or maybe we're at a 5 where we have as many of those tests done in an automated fashion as possible. The other thing we need to look at with all of these phases when we break out the requirements is what is the priority of each of those from a business initiative standpoint. And then, going further down that chain, any requirement that we want to meet is going to take people, process, and technology. Whether it's requirement in the planning phase or security or wherever it lays. So once we have a system like that where we can break things out, we can then start down a path of evaluating the organization, excuse me, and then assigning a grade if we want to. We can start putting levels to these things, whether it's based on industry standards or research we've done ourselves or an arbitrary grading process. And then this way we can assess our strengths, our weaknesses, and our risks, and then we can go ahead and prioritize. So one of the things that we wanted to show people here is one way of doing that. Something that we've developed in-house that we've been working on is a DevSecOps maturity assessment tool. And so if we're going back to our CISO here, who initiated this, oops. We can engage with the organization and several facets of the organization with this tool. And as you can see, kind of give a little background of this first. We've taken all those phases and we've broken them out into a set of requirements.
We're looking at your shield, John.
Oh, I apologize.
That's all right.
It's on the wrong screen there. So we've broken these out, and I apologize if this is an eye chart. We've broken these phases out into sets of requirements. So if we look at the planning phase here, for instance, we broke that out into a set of requirements. Like, what does it take to have a successful planning phase? If we're, looking at this from a project standpoint, we're developing an application. What are the requirements that we need in the planning phase to make sure that the development of that application is successful? So some of these things that we have listed here: design DevSecOps process and workflows. It's something as simple as project task management, or threat modeling, or gathering software requirements from the stakeholders. So some of these are from outside looking in are very simple, but a lot of times they can be overlooked by a business if it's just not something that's systematically done. So if we're putting back on our scenario hats here, some of the questions that we can go into, we can pull from this list of requirements. So if I'm talking to the security team in this instance, designing the DevSecOps process and workflows, what does that mean? Some of those things that we would include in that would be DevSecOps process flowcharts, ecosystem tool selection. So, the SCA tool, the SAS tools, the DAS tools, what the developers are using to develop with Visual Studio, VS Code, things like that. The development platform selection. So we would then use that to ask questions and get those answers where we can then start grading. Do you have a process for that? If the organization has a process for that, we can mark that. Do they have people that are carrying that out? So in this case, our CISO here, Frank, do you have security and compliance engineer to own the responsibility of making sure that this is complete? If that's a yes, that's great. Do we have the technology to do that? By that, we mean, in this case, like a team collaboration tools, a set of them. Maybe it's Office 365, maybe it's G Suite, something where people can plan and create documents and collaborate between themselves. So once we have those criteria met, we can then check that box off. So we see that we also can assign a risk to the business. Is it a medium risk? Is it a low risk? Is it a high risk to the business if that process isn't being done? In this case, it's medium risk. It is being done, so there's not a risk to the business. What is the maturity level that we can assign to that? This is something, this first one, for instance, that probably everybody should make sure is being done. So, it's not something that requires additional tooling that a company doesn't probably have yet. In this case, like I said, Office 365 or G Suite. So we can mark that off that, they're mature in it, but it doesn't require a high maturity level. Some of the other things that we can go through, there's security baked into all of these phases. So, we can go down the line here, with some of these questions specifically for the security team before we would move on to, say, the development team and things like that. So, in the planning phase, for instance, secure development infrastructure, do we have that? Do we have the processes in place? Yes. We run infrastructure scans. We make sure that vulnerabilities are taken care of. Patching is done. We have the people that do that. We have the technology that does that. We can mark that off. That's more of a higher risk because if it's not a secure development environment, that's leaving the company open to a security risk. It's also a little more of a higher maturity level because in this one, what we're really insinuating here is that we have a secure development infrastructure, meaning virtual desktop infrastructure. Not every company has mature virtual desktop infrastructure at this point.
John, let me interrupt you for a second. I mean, so going back to, one of the purposes of the workshop overall was to, be able to take and apply some of the concepts that we were describing, so far throughout the discussion. And that's really, where it's important to, take this tool at face value that, really helps you to start breaking down that problem. It's the things that you can honestly look at your organization, assess what state things are in, and then ultimately to really look at, how that potentially impacts the organization based on the risk as you were describing, and start to really allow you to put together some type of plan for approaching this. So that's just something, going back to the, again, how to make all the things that we talk about applied and actionable. It really becomes important to be able to do that versus just having this as a contextual or conceptual conversation.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that we did, within this tool, just to kind of give context around some of the things that are in it. When it came to the roles, we actually made a list of the roles and what the responsibilities of those roles were, so we could make sure that we were fitting the right role with the right requirement as well. So that's another thing, on the assessment that you'll see is that when we have the people aspect of it, what is the role that's going to do this? So this is going to be the software team, for instance, gathering software requirements from stakeholders. So breaking all that down, to Frank's point, is really key to being able to figure out where you are as an organization and what your next initiatives need to be. And to make this simpler, because we didn't want to go through every single thing on the webinar here today, because that would take a long
looking forward
time.
to that.
We did the cooking show model. So we're going to pull this out of the oven here. And we're going to have a fully baked loaf of bread here.
Amazing.
So we filled a bunch of the criteria out. There's a bunch that, we didn't meet. This organization didn't meet. But they met quite a few. And so we can translate those numbers into a grade scale. So, their model completion, where are they with their completion on the DevSecOps model? A little over 50%. I would say that's probably not bad. There's definitely some work to do, but it's not the worst. There's definitely a lot of maturity in there that they do, from the security aspect. The other thing we can do with this, the risk is scored a little differently. Risk would be 100% if you're not doing anything. That goes down naturally as the more processes and tools that you have in place. The maturity level goes up as you do more things. We can also break this down by phase when we do that. So we can kind of get a score chart based on the phases of the DevSecOps model. So they do really well in the planning phase. This financial organization, they've got that down. So it looks like more of theirs is probably like, some of the more advanced tooling, maybe some automation. As we see the development phase, I think security is going to be the most interesting. And a lot of what people are probably interested here. So on security, still some work to do, but again, breach simulation, that's a very mature thing to do. Not every organization is going to be there quite yet. Some of these other things, threat modeling, that's a pretty mature thing to do. So that's something that this organization has to start doing as well. So as we see, we can kind of get, our heads wrapped around a little bit more of where an organization's at. And then we can begin to start to compile a list of initiatives that we can then correlate to business objectives and hopefully be able to secure budget for those. And, as it relates to CapEx and OpEx expenses within a company. So, going back to that presentation, we can see how we can take these things and effectively put them into a evaluation model. And we can start to prioritize those things. So, that kind of brings us to defining a path forward to achieve DevSecOps success. Being able to use that tool and correlate them, as I said, to making a business justification, using the assessment to figure out your current state versus your desired future state, and identifying the gaps that you need so you can find the right solutions. And again, this is all incremental changes. So, but this is something that we can do, that we can integrate with the business objectives and then be able to get that budget for that. So if we're going back to our assessment, we're talking auditor and CISO here. The grading definitely shows need for improvement across many of the areas, but we can narrow these down to by priority to address the highest risk items first, and then justify these from a risk and financial standpoint to the business. Out of these items, what poses the biggest risk to your business as a financial institution?
So we were, in the process of developing an application, and we knew that we had some potential exposure because, again, you mentioned we're a financial institution, and there was a chance that we were going to have the auditors or regulators looking at that, making sure that we were not open or had the potential risk for compromising any PII or PCI information. And so, we definitely identified the fact that we needed to do some penetration testing immediately. And the goal of that, and recognizing that, we had gone through and done some of the items we talked about earlier with the testing as part of the development cycle, we wanted to use that as a way to validate whether we had caught all the things that we potentially had with this application that were vulnerabilities. And again, there was some pretty high stakes risks with that because of the profile of the application in our business. So that was one of the things that we definitely identified as one of the items that we should go and attack and take care of immediately.
Yeah, and I mean, again, as we said before, some of these financial, some of these vulnerabilities, they pose a very steep financial risk, especially in the case of a financial institution. If you're talking like a banking application or something like that, a breach of that magnitude, we have seen it with some banks, Capital One, even larger retailers like Target. It could be in the millions of dollars. So, it's a good start, and it's a good example of how an assessment like this can lead to mitigating risk and getting budget to complete important projects. I think it's also worth noting that as we further secure the development and applications and infrastructure, it makes it easier to meet auditor and compliance requirements. So, being able to come up with the evidence for audits and stuff like that is going to be a lot easier, because if we're securing all those things and we're tracking all those things, I know I've been in many audits myself and had to, compile evidence, whether it was from an issue tracking system or a monitoring system. If we're using it effectively in the way that it should be, it should not be as much of an issue. I would also, again, encourage the audience, if there's anybody out there that's got any kind of examples of, how they've defined their path forward, or how they've made a business case for any of the initiatives that they have in a DevSecOps model or digital first, definitely feel free to speak up. I guess that goes to the next point here. How do those goals align? The DevSecOps goals, how do they align with the digital first strategy? I think some of the more important parts are boosting productivity. That's usually a goal of every company. Improving efficiency, reducing cost. I bolded that one because that's probably the most important for any organization. Solving complex business challenges, and encouraging innovation. Again, going back to the conversations we've had on previous slides, if we're doing all of this right, we should be making processes so efficient, and we should be automating so much that we are opening our employees up to innovate more rather than fighting fires. I think that doesn't get enough credit where it's due. There's a lot to be said about time for innovation versus always combating issues within an organization or running around like you got your head cut off. A lot of that innovation leads to more financial success for an organization as well. I think transitioning from the assessment to defining a program, supporting capital and operating budget, and then, spurring that continuous improvement, and making progress. That's how we also, align digital first and digital transformation plans for an organization. Frank, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that.
I did want to, we just did get a question, and I'll just read it quick. what are some of the investments required to adopt the DevSecOps program? So that's very, very timely. And I can certainly take a stab at answering that.
Sure.
So that's and then you can weigh in as well. So one of the things that becomes highlighted from the going through the assessment is the fact that there's in some cases, I know you showed the different roles that are required. There might be some cross training required, so training, allocation of investment for that. Also, as we talked about, there might be some identification of tools that either don't exist or need to be updated to support the organization. And then we also have the actual just the ongoing operational component as well. So that's something that in order to achieve that continuous sort of posture, there's things that have to be done from an ongoing perspective. So the goal, and again, just specifically to respond to that question, is to really define what those elements are. This is not just a one-shot deal, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes related to the program view of this. But the goal is to get to a point where you have those maturity levels identified that you want to strive towards, and to break it down into an overall approach based on your risk profile, as well as what your current state is as an organization and how quickly you want to achieve the progress that we discussed. So any other further comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, you summed it up pretty well. I mean, again, these being able to leverage these business use cases to get budget and reach, that continuous improvement aspect, that's huge. I mean, and I think that it makes it a lot easier to make those business cases when you can put them into these buckets. Are we raising productivity? Are we raising efficiency? Are we reducing cost? Another huge driver of business on this. Well, actually, before we get to that, again, encouraging audience interaction. If there's anybody in the audience, that wants to chime in, we would definitely like to hear how you define digital first, or how your organization defines digital first, and if you have a digital first strategy and what it is. But kind of dovetailing off of this, huge driver of business, incorporating compliance standards. Compliance drives a lot of decisions in organizations. I think it's probably one of the biggest drivers of decisions in an organization. So how does this fit into it? If we're, as it says, how does technology impact an organization, and what is its role in a digital first strategy? Well, automating, collaborating, streamlining workflows, all of those things equal cost savings and reduce risks. This little graphic that we have pinned here was really just a question that was asked of DevOps practitioners, what compliance standards they had to adhere to. And that's just to say, like, they had to correlate what they do to those compliance standards, and did it have an effect on meeting those compliance standards? So as we see, I mean, there's definitely a lot of compliance standards listed there. We've got, ISO, we've got Sarbanes-Oxley. But again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, with audits that I've been in, greater efficiencies and all this stuff leads to greater tracking and audit capabilities. So most of the process and tools within a DevSecOps model end up being required in some form or another to either pass audit criteria or provide evidence to auditors. So I think it's very important to try and implement as many of those practices and processes as you can. I think another thing that we want to mention too is compliance as code and security as code. And I think the importance of that comes into play, as we codify more of the SDLC infrastructure and security actions, compliance becomes a result of that. It also ensures that policy is followed and is repeatable at scale because it's coded, it's baked into what you're deploying. An organization no longer has to rely on manual collection of evidence for audit requirements because you're codifying everything. I think that would probably simplify audits for any organization. So when we're thinking about this, I think that's one of the major points to take away from this is you can hopefully make your life easier and your organization's life easier when it comes to audit compliance and going through those audits, because those can be lengthy and grueling. I think we've all been through a few, and you know they definitely are not fun.
Well,
But
to that point, John, sorry to interrupt you. With everything being more or less documented, with everything being able to be traced, it just basically gives you that full audit trail. And then also, when we haven't talked about this enough, if there were any type of requirements to do some type of incident response or tracing the results of some type of incident, you have all that information there as well, so that you have the ability to quickly identify whether there was something, however something might have been induced into an environment. The goal is obviously not have that happen, but if for some reason you had to have that information available, this becomes a even better way to facilitate that as well.
Yep. I mean, it removes a lot of questions around data and network security too, if all the infrastructure, application, and security requirements are put into code. Just a way to make sure that the criteria for auditable controls can be met in an easier way. Again, going back to what we've been preaching, in some of the earlier slides too, security becomes embedded in the process instead of being an event. I think that's probably the biggest shift in thinking out of this is companies that are used to that event-driven security is being able to embed security instead of thinking of it as an event.
We've talked obviously a lot about DevSecOps, but we also are touching upon risk and compliance, which are in a lot of cases separate entities within an organization. So that further pulls those entities closer together to be part of the overall SDLC as well, and that's an important aspect of going through this process as well.
Yep, and we encourage everybody on the webinar to chime in with your feedback if you've got any feedback with your own organization on how the DevSecOps model assists in meeting compliance standards. Because if so, we'd definitely like to hear. I mean, that's the whole point of this, is finding a reason to do this stuff and making it actually fit into the business. Again, how do we align this around a successful DevSecOps practice? Or how do we align an organization around a successful DevSecOps practice? As we pointed out earlier, people, process, technology, that's at the core of this. Every requirement is going to require those three things. Those three things are going to be wrapped in a nice little wrapper of governance, which, the idea of this is to encourage security and governance as second nature. We want security to be baked into every aspect of IT. We don't want it to be an afterthought. We don't want it to be an event. That philosophy makes it easier to align DevSecOps with the digital first strategy, because it's already going to be being done in everything that you do. It's going to be baked in. Hopefully this will provide speed, efficiency, and security of development and operations as well. I mean, that's going back to the previous slide, with greater efficiency and time to market and all that stuff. The whole point of this isn't to introduce more complexity to an environment. It's to introduce efficiencies and simplicity, having things being codified, making them repeatable, push button. That's where we want to get organizations to. And also, as we bake security into all these things, having an easier ability to identify metrics and define metrics and create scoring methods for an organization to figure out where they stand when it comes to a maturity level. And, I think kind of just going through some of these bullet points on the left here, they're important. I mean, going back to the assessment tool, finding the right balance and distribution of roles. All these requirements require different roles. Integration of security controls and tools throughout the SDLC. Using DevSecOps practices to automate and substitute traditional controls. Validate and measure success of DevSecOps compliance efforts by continually monitoring status of compliance. That's going to be huge. It's going to make your audits easier. It's going to make meeting those compliance standards easier. And then being able to scale those compliance practices across the organization.
Yeah, that second to last bullet point, we just had a question come in. Do you think boards are going to become more involved based on recent breaches and some of the events that are going on around us? And I think that ties right into that item, as well as the previous slide where we were talking about risk and compliance. There's no question that we have to have the ability as organizations to demonstrate what is being done, where those investments are yielding results to secure and protect an organization or its supply chain, depending on the business model. And that's, those are the types of things that definitely assist by implementing the types of things that we've been discussing today.
Yeah, and not to leave anything out too, when it comes to vulnerability management and being holistic, that also includes, when you talk about supply chain management and stuff, third-party risk, all of that.
Right.
I think right now that's a bigger focus than it's probably ever been too. We've got a lot of contractors doing things. We've had a lot of supply chain disruptions because of the pandemic itself, even. So being able to protect against those by having the proper processes in place is huge.
Right. So I know we're at the end of our time, and we had a couple of additional questions which we could follow up on separately, but I know there was a call to action that you wanted to highlight as part of sort of the wrap up here. So maybe cover that, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, just to close this all off, anybody that's on this webinar today, hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've gotten some good information out of it, things that you can take back to your organizations. Hopefully you've got some really good ideas from it. As a call to action, we would like to offer a DevSecOps primer session. And what we mean by that is we want to offer you, ASMGI wants to offer you a 2-hour DevSecOps primer session to begin the process of educating your organization about DevSecOps, including qualifying the organization for a DevSecOps maturity assessment. This is something that we have developed to assess an organization on their maturity level of their processes throughout the software development lifecycle. And we would definitely like a chance to talk to anybody who's open to having a 2-hour session, and hopefully we can help your organization further their initiatives around being digital first and DevSecOps.
All right, great. Well, we appreciate everyone's time today. Hopefully this was helpful. We know that we covered a lot of ground, so we'll make sure you have access to this information once it gets posted online. And then, as John mentioned, we'd love the opportunity to have further conversations with you. And we know that we're winding down the year, but if you'd like to get in touch with us and schedule a time, probably post holidays to have that primer session, we'd love to continue the discussions with your organization and see if we could help you to understand how you can further apply this to your overall initiatives.
Yep. And my email is down at the bottom there. So if you want to take that down really quick, feel free to. If you have any questions regarding this webinar at all, feel free to email me and we'll get back to your questions as fast as we can.
All right. John, it's been a pleasure as always.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.